It began on a warm night in Culiacán. A night when the city's streets should have been filled with the usual rhythm of life, headlights snaking through traffic, families gathering around late dinners, young people laughing in the plazas. Instead, silence was broken by the rattle of gunfire. Not random. Not reckless. Deliberate. Coordinated. A message written not in words, but in blood. By morning, that message would be impossible to ignore. Bodies hung from bridges. Men, faceless, nameless to the public, dangled lifeless in the glow of the rising sun. Their torsos bore crude warnings carved or painted by hand. Their killers hadn't simply murdered them, they had staged them like trophies. A city that had once belonged to the Sinaloa Cartel now stood as a stage for war. To the outside world, Culiacán was supposed to be safe, at least safe compared to Tijuana or Juarez, places where violence had already consumed entire communities. But on that night, the illusion shattered. Culiacán was no longer just the home of the world's most powerful cartel. It was a battlefield where betrayal, greed, and vengeance would spill into the open. And as dawn broke, the city awoke to terror. Parents hurried children away from bridges. Reporters whispered warnings before their cameras were shut down. Everyone knew the truth, this wasn't random violence. It was a declaration. A brutal reminder that the Sinaloa Cartel, once united under one leader, was tearing itself apart from the inside. The war was no longer against the government. It was Sinaloa versus Sinaloa. El Chapo Guzman was behind bars, but his shadow stretched across every corner of the city. His sons, Los Chapitos, were eager to prove themselves, ruthless, reckless, and hungry for control. Meanwhile, his old partner, El Mayo Zambada, the ghost-like figure who had outlived every rival, was not ready to step aside. Culiacán had always been theirs. The city fed them, protected them, feared them. But that night, fear took on a new shape. No longer the quiet fear of whispered names, or the unseen power of men in shadows. This was open war. The bridges became billboards of terror. The streets became rivers of blood. And the question that haunted every resident that morning was simple. If the cartel was now at war with itself, what chance did ordinary people have of surviving the storm? But this wasn't just about one night. It was about decades of alliances forged and broken. Smuggling routes worth billions. And leaders who would rather burn their city to the ground than surrender their power. The images of bodies hanging above Culiacán were more than shock. They were a symbol. A message to allies and enemies alike. The Sinaloa Cartel was at war with itself, and the city would pay the price. To understand how it all came to this night, to understand why brothers turned against brothers, and why Culiacán bled under its own kingpins, we need to go back. Back to the roots of the empire. Back to the rise of El Chapo, El Mayo, and the brothers who would tear the cartel apart. To understand the night the bodies hung over Culiacán, we must first understand the empire that built the city, and the betrayals that would one day destroy it.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
To understand how Culiacán became the heart of a civil war, we have to go back. Back to a place unlike any other in Mexico, a land of rugged mountains, endless valleys, and remote villages. This was Sinaloa. A state both blessed and cursed. Blessed with fertile soil and thick jungles where crops could thrive. Cursed with poverty so deep, entire generations were left with two choices, starvation or the drug trade. By the 1960s and 70s, the world had already found a use for Sinaloa's land. Marijuana and opium poppies bloomed under the sun, feeding a new empire of drugs flowing north into the United States. Farmers became smugglers. Smugglers became millionaires. And the government? They looked the other way, as long as the right people were paid. From this soil rose men who would one day rule entire continents. One was Joaquin Guzman Lora. The world would come to know him as El Chapo. Small in stature, but ruthless, cunning, and ambitious. A man who started as a poor farmer's son in La Tuna, selling oranges, until he realized the real money wasn't in fruit, but in drugs. But Chapo was not alone. Ismael Zambada Garcia, known simply as El Mayo, was different. Calm, calculating, invisible. A man who avoided the spotlight, never photographed, never arrested. While others sought fame, Mayo sought survival. It was this patience that would allow him to outlast them all. And then came the Beltran Leyva brothers. Arturo, Alfredo, Hector, and Carlos. Born into the same soil, raised with the same hunger, but known for a different kind of brutality. Where El Mayo relied on patience and Chapo on cunning, the Beltran Leyvas embraced violence. For them, loyalty was bought in blood. Together, they formed an alliance. The Sinaloa Cartel. An empire built on trust, fear, and billions of dollars in cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and meth. For years, they expanded their reach. Colombia supplied the product. Sinaloa moved it north. The United States devoured it. And the money returned south in rivers of cash. At its height, Sinaloa was not just a cartel. It was the cartel. A machine so vast, it reached every corner of the globe, from Europe to Asia, from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Chicago. But with every empire, cracks begin to form. Ambition grows. Greed whispers. And trust becomes fragile. El Chapo and El Mayo worked side by side, but their visions were not the same. Chapo thrived on chaos, building tunnels, bribing politicians, escaping prisons. Mayo thrived on silence, avoiding cameras, never making enemies he couldn't outlive. The Beltran Leyva brothers? They thrived on fear. This uneasy balance held the empire together. But only for so long. Because alliances in the cartel world are like glass. They shine. They look unbreakable. But when they shatter, the cuts never heal. And in the years to come, betrayal would arrive. Not from the outside. Not from the Mexican government or the DEA. But from within. The Sinaloa Cartel, once untouchable, was on the edge of tearing itself apart. And it all began with one betrayal that no one saw coming. The downfall of El Chapo would shatter the fragile peace within Sinaloa, and open the gates to a civil war that would leave bodies hanging from bridges. For decades, Joaquin Guzman Lora, El Chapo, was untouchable. A man who had escaped prison not once, but twice. A man whose name carried fear from the mountains of Sinaloa to the streets of New York. But even legends fall. And when they do, they don't just crash, they drag entire empires down with them. El Chapo's first fall came in 1993, in Guatemala. He was captured and extradited to Mexico, locked away in Puente Grande prison. But Puente Grande was no ordinary prison. It was a fortress that he quietly turned into his palace. Guards were bribed, warden controlled, and walls meant to confine him became his protection. Until 2001, when he walked free, rolled out of the gates hidden inside a laundry cart. That escape cemented El Chapo as a legend. The man who could not be held. The man who made the Mexican government look powerless. With his freedom, the Sinaloa Cartel grew stronger than ever. Cocaine shipments multiplied. Routes expanded. Politicians and police became pawns on his payroll. But every empire attracts enemies. And for El Chapo, it wasn't just the DEA or the Mexican government. It was the people closest to him. The Beltran Leyva brothers felt betrayed, cut out of key routes, their influence fading. Their response would ignite bloodshed that even Chapo couldn't contain. In 2014, the unthinkable happened. After more than a decade on the run, El Chapo was captured again in Mazatlan, found in a modest apartment by Mexican Marines. The man who had mocked the government was paraded before cameras. For the first time, it seemed the legend had ended. But legends don't die so easily. Just a year later, El Chapo vanished from prison again. Through a mile-long tunnel dug beneath his cell, complete with lights, ventilation, and a motorcycle waiting on tracks. The world watched in disbelief. The Mexican government had been humiliated once again. For months, El Chapo taunted the authorities. He met with actors, gave interviews, and basked in the spotlight. But fame is dangerous. And in 2016, his arrogance caught up with him. Mexican Marines stormed a house in Los Mochis after a tip-off. After a bloody firefight, El Chapo was dragged from a sewer tunnel, covered in mud. This time, there would be no escape. In 2017, he was extradited to the United States. In 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison. The most powerful drug lord in the world was now locked away in a U.S. supermax prison, destined to die behind concrete walls. But El Chapo's fall did not bring peace. It opened the gates to something far worse. The empire he had built now had no king. His old ally, El Mayo Zambada, remained in the shadows, too cautious to seize the throne outright. And in the chaos, Chapo's sons, Los Chapitos, stepped forward. These were not men like Mayo. They were brash, impulsive, reckless. They grew up in wealth, but wanted to carve their names in blood. And as they rose, the fragile balance between old power and new ambition began to collapse. The war for Sinaloa had begun. With Chapo gone, Sinaloa split in two, El Mayo's old guard against Los Chapitos. And in the streets of Culiacán, their war was about to explode. When El Chapo's cell door closed for the last time, a silence fell over Sinaloa. For years, the empire had bowed to his decisions. Every smuggler, every gunman, every politician on the payroll knew who the king was. But now the throne was empty. And in that silence, two powers moved into the light. On one side was El Mayo Zambada, the survivor. The man who had outlived every rival, every betrayal, every war. He knew the business better than anyone alive. He had no need for fame. His wealth, his power, and his reach were unquestioned. To many inside the cartel, Mayo was stability. But on the other side were Los Chapitos. Ovidio, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Joaquin Guzman Lopez. The sons of El Chapo. Raised in luxury, protected by their father's empire, they had never known true poverty. But they carried his name. And with it, a hunger to prove themselves worthy of his legend. Los Chapitos were different. Where Mayo preferred diplomacy, they chose violence. Where Mayo built quiet alliances, they flaunted power with gold-plated rifles, narco music, and social media posts. Their followers admired their recklessness. To many, they were modern icons of cartel culture. To others, they were dangerous children playing with fire. Soon, the cracks inside the cartel widened. Some commanders swore loyalty to Mayo, unwilling to follow Chapo's sons. Others flocked to Los Chapitos, seduced by their wealth and charisma. Friends became enemies. Allies turned to rivals. The Sinaloa Cartel, once united, was fracturing. But division alone doesn't start a war. It takes a spark. And that spark came in blood. Ambushes began across Culiacán. Convoys were attacked. Safe houses riddled with bullets. Entire neighborhoods woke to the sound of machine gun fire as factions tested each other's strength. The people of Sinaloa, once shielded by the cartel's control, now lived in fear. No one knew who truly ruled. One day, Mayo's men patrolled the streets. The next, Los Chapitos' gunmen replaced them. The same city that had once worshipped its cartel protectors was now held hostage by their war. For Mayo, patience was survival. He avoided confrontation when he could, using decades of connections to steady his influence. But Los Chapitos didn't wait. They attacked rivals, kidnapped enemies, and broadcast their power with brutal displays. Each move escalated the conflict. Each day, the chance for peace slipped further away. The battle lines were drawn. Old guard against new blood. Experience against recklessness. Mayo had outlived kings before. But this time, his rivals carried his old ally's name, the blood of El Chapo. and that made them dangerous in ways he had never seen. As tensions grew, whispers spread of an inevitable confrontation. People in Culiacán said it was no longer a matter of if the cartel would turn on itself, but when. And that one was approaching fast. The night was coming when the city would become a battlefield, and bodies would hang from its bridges. And then it happened, the night Culiacán was turned into a war zone. A night of convoys, gunfire, and terror, the night bodies hung over the city. Culiacán had seen violence before. Drive-by shootings. Kidnappings. Quiet assassinations whispered about but never spoken aloud. But nothing, not even the darkest days of the cartel wars, prepared the city for that night. The night the silence shattered. It began with convoys. Dozens of SUVs, armored, blacked out, moving in coordinated packs. They rolled through neighborhoods like armies, engines growling, rifles pointing from open windows. Families shut their doors. Children pressed their faces against the floor. Everyone knew, when the convoys came, death followed. Then came the gunfire. A thunder that rolled through the city. It wasn't random, it was everywhere. Coordinated attacks lit up intersections, bridges, and safe houses. The sound of .50 caliber rounds shook windows. Grenades exploded in distant barrios. The city of Culiacán had become a battlefield. Inside homes, families huddled in silence. Mothers pressed their hands over children's ears. Fathers prayed for the gunfire to move on. For hours, no one dared step outside. Not the police. Not the army. Not even the journalists. Because when the cartel fought itself, no one was safe. At intersections, barricades appeared. Gunmen dragged vehicles across the road, turning city blocks into traps. Armed men checked IDs, deciding who would live and who would vanish. Culiacán's streets, once filled with music and laughter, were now ruled by terror and silence. But the horror was not just in the firefights. It was in the message left behind. As the night bled into dawn, the city saw it. Bodies hanging from bridges. Lifeless men swaying above the morning traffic, their faces hooded, their torsos painted with warnings. A message not for the people, but for rivals: this is our city. Drivers froze at intersections. Some covered their children's eyes as they passed beneath the bridges. Others whispered prayers, afraid even to look. The city had been turned into a stage, and the hanging bodies were the opening act of a war no one could stop. The government responded, but only in appearance. Soldiers rolled in with armored trucks. Helicopters hovered overhead. But everyone knew the truth. The soldiers would leave. The convoys would return. And the war would go on. To the people of Culiacán, that night was unforgettable. Not because it was the first time they had seen violence, but because it was the first time they realized the violence had no rules anymore. The cartel was no longer one. It was two armies, both claiming the same throne, both willing to burn the city to ashes for control. The bridges told the truth. The bodies told the truth. Sinaloa was no longer united. The night of terror in Culiacán was not just a battle. It was a declaration: the civil war had begun. But the bodies on the bridges were only the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, the war escalated. More bodies. More betrayals. And the world would finally begin to notice that Culiacán was no longer a city, it was a battlefield. The dawn after the night of terror should have brought relief. But for Culiacán, morning didn't mean peace. It meant silence, the heavy silence of a city too afraid to breathe. Streets once filled with music and chatter now echoed only with the crunch of boots and the hum of helicopters. By midday, the news had spread across Mexico. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones. Headlines screamed of bodies on bridges, convoys in the streets, and families hiding in fear. But what they didn't say was worse: the government had lost control. Culiacán no longer belonged to the state. It belonged to the cartel. At first, the government promised action. More soldiers. More police. More operations. But every operation ended the same way: convoys retreating, soldiers outgunned, and cartel men returning the moment the uniforms left. The people of Culiacán saw the truth in real time: the army wasn't protecting them. They were protecting themselves. As the city trembled, whispers grew louder. It wasn't just about bodies on bridges. It was about who ordered them there. The cartel had fractured. The Guzman brothers against the Zambatas. Old loyalties breaking, old debts being collected. And the people of Sinaloa were caught in the middle. Funerals filled the city. Every week, another casket draped in flowers. Another mother weeping into the soil. Another convoy of cars escorting the dead, their windows tinted black. Culiacán became a city of mourning, and no one dared to ask who would be next. Then came the betrayals. Men who had once fought side by side now hunted each other. Safe houses became traps. Meetings turned into ambushes. It wasn't just war, it was a purge, one designed to cleanse Sinaloa of anyone who chose the wrong side. The violence spread beyond Culiacán. Guamuchil. Mazatlan. Even across the border, whispers of the Civil War reached safe houses in Arizona and California. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer a single empire. It was two governments in exile, fighting for one throne. The world finally took notice. International headlines described Culiacán as a city under siege. Foreign journalists spoke of a narco war spiraling out of control. For the first time, the Sinaloa Cartel wasn't just a Mexican problem. It was a global warning. And yet, inside Sinaloa, life went on. Markets reopened. Children returned to school. Musicians played in cantinas again. But the people knew better. They had learned to live with the war, to walk past bullet holes without looking, to ignore the convoys until they disappeared. Culiacán was breathing again, but every breath carried fear. Behind the facade of normalcy, however, the war deepened. New names appeared on banners. New leaders rose, only to vanish days later. The Guzmans, the Zambatas, the loyalists, the defectors, every day blurred the line between ally and enemy. And through it all, one truth grew sharper. Culiacán was no longer just a city of Sinaloa. It was the capital of a civil war. But civil wars do not end with truces. They end with blood. And as Sinaloa's streets grew darker, the world waited for one answer: who would survive the war for the throne, and who would be buried beneath it? The civil war inside Sinaloa did not end with peace talks. It did not end with one handshake, or one leader rising above the rest. It ended the way all cartel wars end, with betrayal, executions, and the kind of silence that comes only after too much blood has been spilled. For the families of Culiacán, there was no celebration. There was only survival. The Guzman brothers, Ovidio, Ivan Archivaldo, and Jesus Alfredo, emerged as one faction. The Zambatas, led by El Mayo and Ismael Zambata's children, stood on the other side. The old unity of the cartel was gone forever. Now, two empires operated in the same land, watching each other like vultures circling over the same corpse. Mexico's government claimed victories. Raids. Arrests. Public displays of firepower. But behind the cameras, soldiers whispered the truth: no one controlled Sinaloa. Not the president. Not the army. Not the police. The men with guns in the streets decided who lived and who died. As the years passed, the Civil War mutated. Some days, there were no gunfights. Other days, entire neighborhoods became battlefields. But even in the quiet moments, the fear remained. Parents taught their children to drop to the floor at the sound of gunfire, as naturally as learning to walk. The world moved on. International media turned to other wars, other crises. But in Sinaloa, the Civil War never truly ended. It became invisible, woven into the rhythms of life. A gunshot here, a missing person there, and every week another grave dug on the edge of town. The question remained: who won? The truth was more disturbing. Nobody won. Not the Guzmans. Not the Zambatas. not the Mexican state. The only winners were the coffins that filled faster than the carpenters could build them. And yet, through all the carnage, one name remained untouchable. El Mayo Zambada, the ghost who never went to prison, who never stopped commanding from the shadows. The Guzman brothers made headlines, but El Mayo remained a myth. In a war where everyone bled, the man who hid in silence outlived them all. But legends don't bury the dead. The people of Culiacán still lived with the consequences. An entire generation grew up in the shadow of convoys and gunfire. Children played soccer on streets marked with bullet holes. Weddings ended in gunshots instead of fireworks. The Civil War had become their inheritance. Even today, years after that night when bodies hung over Culiacán, the city carries scars that never heal. Ask a shopkeeper, and he'll tell you about the day soldiers hid in his store. Ask a mother, and she'll show you the empty chair at her dinner table. Ask anyone in Sinaloa, and they'll tell you the truth: the war never ended. It just learned to live among them. So what is the legacy of the Sinaloa Civil War? It is not measured in who gained power, or who lost territory. It is measured in the silence of a city that no longer trusts the dawn. It is measured in the blood that stains bridges, in the names carved into gravestones, in the nightmares of children who learn too soon that monsters are real. And it is measured in a haunting question that still hangs over Culiacán, like the bodies once did. When the next war begins, will anyone be left to bury the dead? This was the Sinaloa Civil War. The night bodies hung over Culiacán was not the end. It was only a chapter in a story still being written, in gunfire, in silence, and in blood. The story you've just heard is not fiction. It happened, and its shadows still stretch across Sinaloa today. For the people who lived through those nights, there was no pause button, no safe distance. Just survival. If this story made you think, if it opened your eyes to the reality behind the headlines, I'd like to hear from you. What do you believe is the true legacy of the Sinaloa Civil War? Does it end with blood, or is there still hope for peace? Share your thoughts in the comments, your voice matters here. And if you want more untold true crime stories like this one, consider subscribing to this channel. Every week, we dive deep into the stories others are too afraid to tell, stories that reveal the hidden wars, the forgotten victims, and the truths buried beneath silence. Thank you for watching till the very end. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes, the most dangerous wars are the ones you never see coming.